I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with Tony Goldwyn, who stars in The Hot Zone Anthrax. Tony, this limited series takes place a few weeks after 9/11. And what did you make of how creators Brian Peterson and Kelly Souders were really able to so effectively tap into that paranoia and the panicked high tension mindset that really permeated American life after that particular period? Like, I had forgotten about how crazy it was back then, but this show really transports you really, really effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I was really excited when I read the script and when they offered me this role, because the character that I played, Bruce Edwards, was someone I knew nothing about. He was the lead anthrax researcher for the U.S. Defense Department, basically the lab that deals with bioweapons and defense against biological warfare, and his specialty was anthrax. But the thing that most struck me is as you said, it brought me right back to those days post 9/11. It was like 3 weeks after 9/11. These letters were sent out to all the major media outlets and to Congress containing this deadly powder, anthrax. And everyone just assumed it was a follow-on to 9/11, that it was a terrorist act. And I personally, live outside the New York area, although I'm in California at the moment. But we lived in Connecticut at the time, and so 9/11 was deeply traumatic for everyone, but for people in the tri-state area around New York, it was really, we were still in shock 3 weeks after, and so this was very traumatic. And a postal worker at a mill plant about 20 minutes from where we lived died of anthrax poisoning from this, because the letters went through the major, post offices, and the powder escaped and people died.
Yeah.
So a lot of unintended targets. I mean, I think it was 5 or 6 people who died, but you didn't know. So it did. Kelly and Brian's script really brought me back, and the fact that we were filming it in the midst of, in the darkest days of the pandemic, or maybe just after the darkest days, but in the winter of 21 was when we filmed it in the locked down city of Toronto. It was pretty surreal.
It is insane, because it's like Brian and Kelly, they just have this affinity for these pandemic stories. They did Ebola, then they tackled anthrax. I asked them, when are you going to do COVID-19? They just laughed at me and said, no, that's too raw. But the thing is, like, honestly, I think a lot of people had forgotten about the anthrax attacks, because so much has happened since then, and it took a long time for them to get to the bottom of what had happened. Obviously, this show condenses the storyline. And now, spoilers, people, if you haven't seen the show and you're not familiar with the story, go away, watch it, come back, because we're going to have to delve into this a bit deeper. So your character, Bruce, is really fascinating, because I knew nothing really about the story, and I thought, who is this guy? What is he? Is he just a loud, cocky kind of scientist who's going to be the hero of the day? And no, he ends up being completely unhinged and dangerous. So I always ask this question for actors, because I think you just get to really play with that. How thrilling is it? Is it challenging? What was your feel for slowly peeling back those layers and eventually getting to the core of this guy being, pretty much a psychopath?
Yeah, I mean, I had, as you just mentioned, Bruce Ivins was a really interesting, seemingly benign, but a very unhinged guy. And so it was a really interesting character to play, because no one who worked with him had any concept that he might be, the person behind these attacks. And he was definitely eccentric and odd, and liked being the center of attention, and was pretty cocky about his own intelligence and expertise. But he was also a sweet guy, and people were fond of him. But he was, he had a lot of demons, and he was, he had had some terrible childhood trauma, and he had some severe mental illness that he hid, and self-medicated, and had a very high security clearance, and dealt with these deadly materials.
Unbelievable.
So it was very interesting over the 6 hours that the story is told, to figure out how that starts to come about. And as you mentioned, the actual investigation took almost 7 years, and we forgot about it. It was in all the headlines right after, and then there was no clues. Well, they had not found the guy, and then we invaded Iraq, and the government used the anthrax attacks as one of their justifications for going into Iraq, because they pinned it on Saddam Hussein for a minute, and that turned out to be bogus. But so we got distracted by other things. So I, like I obviously it was personally close to me because of where I lived, but then within a couple of months, we were on to the next thing. So I didn't even know anything about this investigation. So it was a total surprise to me. And then getting to play this character who starts in one way and 6 hours, but by the end of it, he's you realize he's quite a different person.
Exactly. And what I find so fascinating about this story is that, and Kelly and Brian do a great job of showing how it became a smokescreen or the trigger for what ended up happening with coalition forces in Iraq, even Afghanistan, and how history has really pivoted from that moment. And a lot of it was because of this terrifying paranoia that permeated life right after 9/11. So the show does a great job of that. But for you, I really appreciated, Tony, how you were able to portray Bruce in a pretty balanced, nuanced, and even unsettlingly vulnerable way. Like, he's not a monster. He's not just the villain. Talk me through the choices that you made to let us lean into him a bit, and then feel very unsettled by who he kind of really is by the end.
Yeah, well, thanks for saying that. I appreciated it, because I honestly, I had tremendous compassion for Bruce. Mental illness is something that is, it is an illness, just like a physical illness, and it's something that so many of us struggle with, and so many of us struggle in silence, and there's so much shame associated with it. And if Bruce Ivins had not been locked in a shame tailspin and had been able to get proper treatment for it, I think he would have been just fine. But sadly, that wasn't the case. So I had a lot of compassion for him. And anytime I'm always interested in the moral ambiguities in all of us, and in the moral boundaries where we like to see ourselves as one thing, and then at different parts of our lives we all cross moral boundaries and tell ourselves that we're not doing it. So Bruce had a very his need to see himself as a hero and as a patriot and as a soldier of good and a do-gooder, was tremendously important to him. So he really, formed an identity that of goodness, and service, and expertise, and intellect, and faith. He was, very involved with his church, and he was a wonderful, very involved father and neighbor to his, and all of that. And yet, the thing with Bruce, but really as a result of his trauma, there was kind of a red line, because Bruce had a lot of profound anger issues that were repressed because of some abuse that had happened, emotional abuse in his childhood. And so what actually happened with him is he had a bifurcated personality. He was diagnosed with a dissociative personality disorder and paranoid personality disorder. So my concept was that Bruce had a red line of anger and dark feelings, and beyond a certain that red line, he literally would black out, and he would not know that he had done. It was like another part of Bruce took over, and there's a whole thing that people see in the show, but he literally had another person he called the other Bruce, and he used to joke about it and write emails as the other Bruce, joking emails to people, and he would have no recollection that he had written them. And it was this kind of dark, demonic, mischievous, and he would go on long drives and have no idea he did it, and he would do things he had no memory of. So that was very interesting to me, and very sad, and I saw, and when he starts to realize this, at least in our story, his world begins to fall apart. he doesn't know what he was capable of, and he's terribly confused, and it's very sad, really.
Yeah, and normally we feel tethered to our perceptions and feelings towards the protagonist or antagonist, and so in this, it's okay to feel compassionate for the guy and even care about him, relate maybe even to him if you've got your own mental health problems, but also really denounce at what he's doing and even call him the villain by the end. That's okay. We can have both. And I like that in between space at this show. I wasn't expecting this show to do that. I thought it was just going to be a straight up procedural action thriller, fantastic, blow me away, and then I move on. No, that's not what this does at all. It's very deep. And so what do you do in pre-production? What did you find helpful to get your head in that mindset?
Well, I just do a lot of research usually when I'm working on a part, and I had the good fortune. For me personally, what I always do is I do as much research as I can, because it just not all of it is useful, but you kind of saturate yourself, and then what's useful starts to emerge. And so in this case, I was very lucky because there was a biography written about Bruce Ivins, and the whole investigation. Michael Willman, who was a reporter at the LA Times, wrote a book called Mirage Man, and it's about Bruce Ivins and the whole, it was really focused on the investigation, and in addition to his biography, the way that it was used as justification to go to war in Iraq. But anyway, it has all this wealth of information about Bruce's childhood and his whole past, and all of his mental illness, and his testimony from his doctors and co-workers, and about his marriage and his kids. And so that was just a Bible for me, because Willman's book is very well written and interesting. So that you don't always get that lucky. So, and then in addition, I just read a lot, and I did not talk to the family because that was a little too sensitive, and I didn't want to impose on them. But yeah, that was really it, and talk to psychiatrist friends and people just so I could understand what living inside that head might have been like.
Yeah. You mentioned not speaking to the family. Obviously, people have to also realize not only are you playing a certain type of person, he's also a real person who has family members and colleagues and friends that know him, remember him. And so there was a bit of a sensitivity there in the show. I remember Kelly and Brian telling me that. There were victims as well, families of the victims. And so did that sense permeate the production, that everyone wanted to stay true to the story and also be sensitive to what people might be thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a mixed thing. At a certain point as an actor, you have to alleviate yourself of that, because I can't worry too much about, essentially I'm creating a fictional character because I didn't know the guy. No. You know what I mean? So, and he wasn't a very famous person. So it's a little different than if I'm, I've also played very real people who were quite famous. And then it's a different kind of responsibility that you have. In this case, I guess what I felt about my responsibility to people that might have known Bruce is just that I was trying to approach it from his heart, where he was at. And all I can say is I hope I did that. And if I didn't, then people would be upset to watch it. But it's certainly I can't control that. In terms of the factual stuff, yes, I think there was a lot of attention to try and get it right and get the science right and be accurate, so that and it was National Geographic, so they obviously were very attentive to that. And while a lot of the things are conflated, and as you always do, you have to take some dramatic license in terms of new characters and combining characters and conflating events and compressing timelines. That is the normal stuff. But I think in general, there really was a lot of effort to try and get it right, and particularly for those families who are victims, to play them in a faithful way, I think. And
so in the last couple of episodes, we see that he's more unhinged, and in your performance, 1 minute, you're quite fun and silly, and then in the group therapy session, he acts out his frustration and trauma about his mother with a fellow patient, role-playing his father, and it's super intense. He loses it. And I always think with actors, Are those opportunities to really go big exciting? And then do they play a bit of a personal or emotional toll on you afterwards? Or are you one of those people that are able to just leave it on set and move forward?
Yeah, I can pretty much shake it off. I don't, it's a pretty rare thing when, you know, you get sort of, you're sort of exhausted or whatever, but yeah, no, I typically don't, you know, I'm not infected by it. Sometimes when you live in a character for a long period of time, when it's over, you have trouble kind of shaking it off. In this case, yeah, so, you know, there is that with this one scene where I just had to let go, and Bruce, we did this sort of improvisation where Bruce loses control in a group therapy session. And yeah, I don't know, it's hard to even reflect too much on it, because as an actor, you just kind of give over to it and hope that it's not terrible.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just trust and commit, and hope that it comes out, you know, in a good way, and trust the director.
True. And that was the feedback I was getting from Kelly and Brian as well. They were, in fact, they mentioned that they were really amazed at how you were able to so effectively switch his mindset from one to the other, and that there was this electricity on set when you were doing that. I always found your performances to be really emotionally intelligent, all the way back to like Scandal and the stuff you've done since. It reminds me though, Tony, of this, and I'm sure you get this all the time, but it's something that I just have to ask. I'd be remiss if I didn't. And that's, you know, it's more than 30 years ago when you were in Ghost.
Yeah.
Right. I was 12 years old when that came out, and it was my favorite film. I've probably seen it 50 times. And now I've gotten to introduce it to my own kids who are around that age, 12 and 13. And I just want to know, you know, by the way, you've barely aged since. I don't know what you're doing, right? But I'll tell you secrets. I want to get offline. When you look back, what's your favorite memory of those days on the set with Demi and Patrick and Whoopi? Because I mean, people love that movie.
It was, I love that movie. I mean, that was a magical time for me. You know, if you have one of those in a career, you're just so lucky. And I've been lucky enough to have a couple, but that was the first thing. And so I have so many fond memories of it. You know, my wife, Jane, was the production designer on it, and her career had already blown up. She was already doing lots of big movies, but that was my first one, and we got to do it together. And our first daughter was conceived during that movie, because I finally realized I'd be able to earn a living at this. And
yeah,
so that was just like, maybe we can have kids. So, but a specific memory, honestly, that is the most resonant for me, was my first day of work on it. I drove onto the Paramount lot, and it's this very beautiful movie studio. It's my favorite studio. You just classic old Hollywood. People would recognize it because you've seen it in so many movies.
Yeah.
And there was a parking space with my name on it. And, you know, I go to the gate and they're not sure they're going to let me in. They're like, yes, Mr. Goldwyn, come in. And I was walking to the stage, the big sound stage where we were filming, stage 19. And I'm just like, you know, I just couldn't believe it was actually real. And I turned around, I looked, and there was a building behind me, you know, down the little street. And I had about 2 months before that, I had been in that building auditioning for some terrible pilot for a sitcom, and had been made to wait in a hallway with about 50 other actors. There were no chairs. We were all sitting on the floor. And I waited for over an hour, I think. It was just humiliating. And then I remember they called my name, and I went in and read, and the casting director literally did not even look up. She sat behind her desk and she's like, yeah, sit down. All right, do the first scene. And she was like this the whole time, just reading anything. Okay, next scene. Didn't even look at me once. And I'd been waiting for over an hour, and it was so humiliating. It's such a, you know, like, it doesn't happen very often. Most people are not like that, but as a young actor, it's just awful. And, you know, my point is, the walls seemed so high and so insurmountable. I was like, how am I ever, this is crazy. How am I ever going to get a break? Like, this is insane that I have to do this. So anyway, on my first day of work, having one of the leads in a, you know, big movie, and going to start rehearsal for my first day, and turning around and seeing that, I was like, never forget this moment. Like I had somehow scaled the walls, or the walls evaporated and they didn't really exist. They were just in my head. And so that is the most resonant moment, you know, in approaching, walking into that stage, and there's Demi Moore and Jerry Zucker, the director, and we're having our first day of rehearsal. And yeah, it was sublime. It really was.
Wow, that is such a cool story. Fast forward 30 odd years and here you are, like, you know, a household name. Tony, congratulations on some great work in that show. And thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thanks. It was great to talk to you.